right, we better get moving since there is a lot to cover today. Oh, one of the things that you'll find out is I put some thoughts down for question number 3. One of the things that happened in this time of the 530s when these volcanoes were erupting is the stuff that got into the atmosphere. The dust and the haze blocked out the rays of the sun. I think there's one author that mentions that in the middle of the summer, the sun at midday wasn't strong enough to cast a shadow. Do you remember when we had some of like the smoke from the Canadian wildfires some years, and it's just been kind of hazy and gray and funky colored? Imagine that kind of thing for several years at a time and more. And so one of the things would be that like the sun will never be the same again. Some preachers and crazy people would have said it's because you're too sinful. Now God hates you. And the end of the world talk and the apocalyptic stuff, you can bet that was going around on steroids. And the odd thing is that it's actually true. It is the ending of a world. It's just not the end of the whole world. And those kind of moments have happened in history far more often than we give them credit for. I mean, the first time Rome was sacked by the barbarians, I think that was the feeling of many of the Christians. And sometimes, I mean, we forget that there have been things like the signs in the heavens and the sun is darkened and all of these weird phenomena. Evidently, if you read some first-hand accounts from Poland in 1939, when the Nazis started their blitzkrieg, they had some of the same things. The sun did weird things and the moon didn't show up and all of these things that they interpreted along the lines of the book of Revelation. That one's much closer to our own time. And again, I would say the challenge is that it was the ending of a world. It's just not the end of the whole world. And we face things like that in our lives where we universalize interpretations or we universalize signs. We take something and make it dramatically bigger than it is. No, it's a big deal, but it's hard to know exactly how big a deal it is or what it's going to mean. I mean, we may be living through one of these kind of times now. We might experience in our lifetimes with the current political situation the ending of a world. But it doesn't necessarily mean that nothing will remain of it or that everything will fall apart. At least we hope not. But I mean, even if you think about it in kind of the modern context or under other lenses, like if we would have an event that would cause us to lose 50% of our population, the economy would crash. It would fall apart. Nothing that we have and nothing of the way that we do things is built for that kind of shock to the system. I mean, we would even have trouble if like shipping stopped, if the maritime traffic between places like China and the Western United States stopped. Like even that, and that could be, you know, from any number of things that have nothing to do with actual war, but it's just like, even that would be a shock to the system that we're just not quite prepared for. Now in another 10 years, it might be a different story, but it would be pretty challenging. So we have to jump into the life of Justinian. So to resituate ourselves a little bit, the western part of the empire has basically collapsed. We're into the late 400s. Has collapsed as being ruled by something that we could call the Roman Empire. Now, there's certainly still people in the West, there's still cities, but it's not the same kind of organized polity or political system that they had in the east. This is the Eastern Roman Empire, headquartered in Constantinople. The time of Justinian is before the rise of Islam and the Muslims, and that will change things in a major way too. So the Eastern Empire is fighting wars very often with a group, I think, called the Sassanids, who are in Persia. The Justinian Empire is out to their east. So Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, that kind of area was ruled by an empire that was pushing in from the east toward the west. The heartland of this Eastern Roman Empire is the modern-day state of Turkey. Justinian was born in 482. His reign as emperor began in 527. So he had about 10 years before everything started going to pieces. And if you remember, the major shocks to the systems had already happened. The decimation of the Roman armies by the plague of Decius and Cyprian, the persecutions, Diocletian, the reform of the Roman government and the Roman economy, all of that has already happened. And so the Eastern Empire is standing in a weakened spot. And they became much better mariners than the Western Romans were, but not as accomplished on the ground. The Roman military machine was something to behold. They were quite good at it. Justinian dies in 565. So he ends up ruling for 37 years, which is a long rule that provides a lot of stability. And he was a man who in many ways was up to the challenge. He was Orthodox. And what I mean by this is not like Catholic Orthodox, like we would have the debate today, but Orthodox in the sense that he's not following the trends of heresy that were prevalent at the time. I think we've mentioned a few of them, like about the Council of Chalcedon and the unity of Christ and the Nestorian controversy, and some of those, like the separation in Jesus between humanity and divinity and how that relationship works. Justinian is an Orthodox. He's a true believer. He follows the faith of the creeds. But he has a different understanding of the relationship between church and state. I don't think he's quite Napoleon saying, I am the state. But he's in that direction. And he definitely sees himself with a role in the church that would make us in the West uncomfortable. Like, yeah, you are claiming a lot of power. That's not for you to do. You're playing politics. The challenge is that Justinian was a fairly religious ruler. He was quite devout. He went to Mass on a regular basis, or the Divine Liturgy as it was probably called at that time. He wanted to build churches and monasteries all over. He was a very Christian emperor. And so this is one of the problems, is that when he talks about the relationship between church and state, it looks good because he's a good guy. He's a capable ruler. He's a devout Christian. And so it would be easy to start thinking, well, some of this fusion between church and state isn't such a bad thing. But it can gloss over some of the problems that are inherent in that kind of understanding because of his personal character, personal charisma. He does seem to have liked being in charge. He liked being the boss. He was a very happy emperor. In the East, I don't know if they've canonized him, but they're close. Like, he's sort of the paragon, the paradigm, the pattern of what it was to be a Christian ruler. Like Justinian, I think they even call him Justinian the Great. He's not called that in the West and therefore in the modern tradition of scholarship because we didn't like him as much. But He has a long reign. Militarily, he works on reconquering many of the western lands. So Justinian is in the time after the invasion of the Vandals through North Africa, and he launches expeditions or these military campaigns to start taking back some of these lands. His major general's name was Belisarius. He's probably one of the smarter generals in history. And I think they even still study his battle plans today, because he very often was able to defeat larger forces with fewer men because he used people well. And he was famous for like springing traps on people, like you're trying to fight a battle and he forces you to go through a canyon where they can cause rock slides or something. Like he used lots of things to his advantage. So they reconquer Rome, ancient Carthage, which had been overrun by the Vandals. Carthage is in the northern part of Tunisia, modern-day Tunisia, north of the city of Tunis. They control Egypt and much of Africa. But the thing about it that you start to see is the areas that are closest to the Mediterranean were the ones that they were most successful in holding on to. So Byzantium, this Eastern Empire, is a much stronger maritime power than the Romans. That means they were much better at sea. So if you can supply it by sea, then it's safe. If you can't supply it by sea, if you have to supply it by land, they struggled more. Justinian builds a major church called the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom. And this was a church of the emperors. There was another one that was the church of the Patriarch of Constantinople. It was called the Church of the Holy Apostles. That one has been destroyed. The Hagia Sophia has a long and tortured history. It's been changed from church to mosque a number of times in its history. And they finally got frustrated and decided it was going to be a museum. And then the modern day Turks said, we're going to make it into a mosque again. It's a challenge. But it's a very, very significant church architecturally. They built it in 20 years, which is like warp speed for the time. I mean, it's brick and stone and building materials without modern construction methods, and they built it in 20 years. It's an engineering marvel. I think it was the largest freestanding dome in the world for a number of centuries, or at least it's close. It's a very, very significant church. We don't know exactly what the interior looks like. They've uncovered some of the mosaics that were a part of it. It does seem like they used mosaic and gold. Mosaic are those little pieces of stone that sort of capture light differently. Usually they're set in plaster. So the church seems to have been covered with much of that, and it's a large church. I mean, if you go to Istanbul today, I would recommend you go to the Hagia Sophia to see it. And because it was located in Constantinople, it becomes associated with a kind of elaborate style, a dramatic, over-the-top, glittering vestments and sort of parades of servers and ministers and people through the church. And the Eastern liturgy still preserves some of that. Justinian also works on rebuilding and strengthening the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai. This is the traditional place of the burning bush and Mount Sinai. There's problems with that, but suffice it to say there's this Orthodox monastery out there that is still there today and has some of the most famous works of art and most famous pieces of history. One of the major texts of the Bible, the earliest complete texts of the Bible, are called the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Sinaiticus. The Sinaiticus comes from this monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, probably at or a little bit before this time of Justinian is when it was written. And these codexes are those two are the first complete texts of the Bible that we have, where you have all the books of the Bible and they're put together and bound as a single volume. We have older texts of the scriptures and of individual books, and especially individual passages, but the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus are the two oldest manuscripts, at least that I know of. And so there's a connection to this monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai. Eventually, it's kind of a funny monastery. They build like a wall around it to keep it safe from raiders, and it was like a giant wall, and they had like this bucket system to get things in, so they'd have to raise it over the wall with a pulley, and there's only a little tiny door in the wall kind of thing, mostly for safety. Justinian is famous for working through a massive update of the Roman legal system. So Roman law, we've talked about this a little bit before, that it doesn't function the way modern American law does. Modern American law, I think, is based on British common law. And so, like, we recognize things like legal precedent. So if another court decided this, the argument that lawyers make all the time is court so-and-so said this, so you should say the same thing. In the Roman legal system that Justinian is working in, that doesn't matter as much. But there was this accretion of law that had grown over time. The Christian emperors preserved much of the laws of ancient Rome, even if they changed them or didn't enforce them. So it's like the legal code just grows by things getting added to it without fixing all of the earlier stuff. You know, they probably cross things out or X them out, but don't actually change the whole text. Justinian revises the whole text, and this survives to this day. So he puts forward, I think, what is called the Legal Code of Justinian, or the Justinian Laws or something. If you look them up on a search engine, you'll find that. Oddly enough, they still maintain some of the pagan pieces of legislation. There's parts of it that are sort of funny. You can tell that they wanted to keep it because it was such an old principle of Roman law, but it sort of doesn't fit into the Christian mind or the Christian legal system. And this is kind of a dividing line or a fork in the road, because after the Code of Justinian, every modern legal system in some way deals with what he says. Now, it's not just him. It's that he initiated, he sponsors this effort by legal minds, or maybe the court system. I mean, they had many of those things, like trial courts and those kind of things. And so he puts his imperial stamp of approval on it, which also means, in sort of typical imperial fashion, that I have decided this, so everything else is null and void and you should burn it all. Like, this is mine, kind of thing. Like the Law Code of Justinian is the one that introduced swearing on a book of religious texts in a court to proclaim the truth. That's still done today in some sense. Sometimes in the United States it gets a little bit funny, but nonetheless, that comes out of Justinian's legal code. One of the challenges that I think we would have with him today is that he starts to make life increasingly difficult for pagans. And so we live in a world that very much believes in the freedom of religion, that religion should be a free exercise of human conscience, and we hope that people practice Christianity and people are sincere in their faith. That's what we work toward. But modern Americans, I think all of us, even as we're all Christians, would have a lot of trouble with the idea of a state imposing Christianity on other people. I mean, I would even say I have trouble with that as a priest, because just like you discovered with teenagers and rules as parents, it doesn't work. You can try and legislate, and you can try and hedge the line and tell them this is what you have to do. but they have to either decide to do it or not, and you can't force them. You can set up rules and you can make it strict enough to try. You could take away their car keys and punish them, but you still can't make them do it. That's about how well this worked for Justinian. Force doesn't usually compel people, or if it does, they're not sincere in it. It causes issues. Now, this is controversial, even at the time, because he does things like closes the school at Athens. So Athens had a kind of school of philosophy ever since the time of people like Plato and Aristotle, where people would send, especially young men, to be educated. And that was a good thing. In some sense, it was one of the oldest forms of a university or a kind of teaching system that would teach people about truth. But they also mixed in paganism, and they based a lot on pagan rituals and on and on and on. So Justinian closes it. And in one sense, you could say, okay, that doesn't sound so bad. But in another sense, it's a real struggle because there's nothing to really replace it in the Christian world. Even at this time, many of the wealthy from Constantinople were sending their sons to Athens to be educated because they didn't have the same opportunity in Constantinople itself. And he does this because there were some pagan teachers still working there, but there were also some Christians working there. So it's just controversial. It's just, I can't tell you that this was absolutely the right thing to do, and I can't tell you that this was absolutely the wrong thing to do. It's just like, well, it caused a lot of issues. Should pagans be persecuted by the state? Like, if you don't practice Christianity, should you be able to build a house? To get a building permit and those kind of things. Should you lose your job? Where do you stop with the rule making and the laws? Where does push come to shove? And it gets even more complicated because not only is it a question of what should be done, but paganism is officially illegal. So you can rightfully accuse people of breaking the law if they're practicing paganism. Is that a good thing to have? Is that not a good thing to have? I mean, in one sense, it's like, well, yeah, it's kind of great because the more you can discourage paganism, the easier and more open people are going to be to Christianity because you're just removing competition. And that should be helpful. But on the other hand, how can you compel religious belief? How does that work? Does it work? And there's an uneasy difficulty in the midst of this kind of question that I don't know that I have a good answer to. I think that both ways have their issues. Both ways have their struggles. The modern position of freedom of conscience leaves a lot of people to basically be atheists. The ancient system of the fusion of church and state can cause all kinds of problems. And you see it here in the time of Justinian. You see it all the way into the Reformation. In England, if you're Catholic, your property can be confiscated, your life is forfeit, and on and on and on, after the time of Queen Elizabeth and the coup against her. Those kind of things. Is that good or is it bad? I think I'd still rather have the modern system, but I'm not convinced it's a whole lot better. A big part of the problem is that the Council of Chalcedon, which was supposed to solve the problem of the Christian disunity and these breaks, these fractures that were happening, the schisms that were happening in Christianity, didn't fix everything. Justinian wants to reunite the Christian world. Egypt had broken off. The Assyrian churches of the East had broken away. We've spoken about those before. Remember that those breaks happen at times where the Roman army isn't there to protect the people and they are left to fend for themselves. And Rome has a different opinion of this debate than the Eastern Christians do. In the mind of Rome, this was settled because the Pope spoke and issued a document that he called the tome and sent it to them and said, this is what you should believe. And the Easterns are sort of like, well, that's nice. Thank you for doing that. We kind of like what you said. And so the Pope is like, see, we're victorious. I spoke, they listened, everything is fine. The East is like, well, you just happened to be a smart guy and you got the answer right. No big deal. That happens sometimes. The Pope also rejects the idea that the emperor has any say in these things at all. Because again, Justinian uses his government power to enforce Christian decrees. So the council has decided this is what you will preach, this is what you will proclaim, this is what you will believe, or we'll cut off your head. It's an easy way to ensure compliance, at least on the surface, but again, does it really work? That's far less certain. This fusion of power causes all kinds of problems. The emperor is responsible for Christian unity. He sees of himself the defender of the church. It is his mission in life to make sure that the Church of Jesus exists as one body. And that doesn't sound so bad. That sounds really good. If we had a ruler today that was like this, we would probably be pretty excited. Someone that was actually a devout Christian that was trying to rule well and trying to lead the people toward the Lord and use the instruments and the organs of the state to actually accomplish real Christianity, I think we would be friendly with that. But on the other hand, should people who, for instance, disbelieve in purgatory be punished by death? Seems a little dramatic. If you don't say the rosary at night, do you get hung in the morning? I have a feeling that some people would be in trouble if this was the case. And so how this relationship between the political life and the church is one that's fraught with difficulty. There are constant problems. And if you really want to see this in spades, look at the history of the Reformation. It is awful, and everyone should be able to admit that. The Catholics killed the Protestants killed the Catholics. It is a royal mess. And they did all kinds of things that are awful, like political persecution, driving businesses out of practice, threatening anyone who did certain things, threatening people who buy from certain craftsmen. You can study Geneva and the Calvinists. They were certainly some of the most significant offenders, but there were many others, and the Catholics certainly aren't innocent in that whole debate as well. So in the Reformation, you have this near absolute fusion between church and state, even in the West. I would argue that one of the greatest achievements of Western Christianity is kicking the state out of the church. Like that state and church are different, they're different domains, different areas of authority, different areas of power. That's one of the major achievements of Western Christianity. We suffer from that a little bit because it's like we have too much separation. The idea was never, from the perspective of the Christians, that you were not supposed to have mixing at all. Like the Reformers and even the Westerners after the compromises would have been horrified at the idea that the state would not support religious schools. That didn't even enter their mind. But it's more, they were concerned, like, should the state dictate theology? Should the state tell you what to believe? So if you have a ruler that decides that Mary isn't the mother of God, is that okay? They can just say that. Church and state are fused, so they impose that on all the churches. You have to stop all the rosaries, no more Mary, see you later, goodbye. And then the next person says, I really like Mary, we're going to put her back. What you start having is theology that's at the whim of the state. It doesn't really make a difference. And you can hear that echoed in so much of modern Protestantism today. It echoes in the lives of Catholics. Well, it's just about believing in God because the details don't matter. Well, it's not that we want to be too harsh with that, but I think Catholicism and historical Christianity actually proclaims the details do matter. Now, there's certainly a hierarchy of truths and positions of authority. Some things are more critical than other ones, but the details matter because the points of theology, the teachings of the church, are meant to be a bit like streetlights. They light a path to the Lord. They light a path to the kingdom of heaven. And we need the path because if you didn't have streetlights, if we took out all the streetlights in Fargo, would it be very easy to drive around? The answer is no. There'd be a lot more crime that happens when things are in the dark. So, yes, in our modern day, we do have what is probably too much separation. And we have a sort of uneasy hostility and cold war between church and state in the world that we live in. On the other hand, the Easterners, and especially Eastern Orthodoxy, has too much fusion between church and state. So, for instance, Vladimir Putin in Russia declares the invasion of the Ukraine, and you can watch videos of the Ukrainian patriarch going to bless the Russian armies as they're going off into the Ukraine. Basically intending to commit genocide. And in Russia, the church is the state. I mean, they have a patriarch and they kind of proclaim to be Christians, but, they should be told, this actually isn't Christian. I think that the Russians should be excommunicated. You either stop promoting this kind of genocidal violence or we're removing you from the Christian communion. You will be outside because you're using faith to justify a takeover of the Ukraine and justify crimes against humanity, and that you can't do. I think that would be a much stronger position than Pope Francis took on the matter, but it's probably why I'm not Pope. I would have said, you guys are done. And I think the Orthodox should say that. The Orthodox should remove the Russians from communion, which would mean then, that Russians couldn't receive communion from other Orthodox and some of those kinds of things. Because it's very, very clear. I mean, they're defending Putin, they're defending the massacre of children, they're defending all kinds of things in the Ukraine that I would argue are just indefensible. And I would say that in the other direction too. If the Ukrainians invaded Russian territory and were doing the same thing, I would say the same thing about the Ukrainians. I just would say that kind of mentality should have no place in Christianity. And it doesn't matter if you're Americans or you're British or you're Canadians or you're Russians or Chinese. No. I think John Paul II would have felt more that way. I mean, he was much more strong on the idea of no more war. But in the time of Justinian, this fusion between church and state means that the decrees and the canons of the four great councils, Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon, have legal force. They're civil laws as well as church laws. That's a different way of thinking about them than we have. Eventually, Justinian kidnaps the Pope. He sends his army to get the Pope and bring him to Constantinople to have a new council to finally settle all the problems. Is it going to work?